Hello, my name is Matt McDonald and I'm a senior lecturer here in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. And I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr Sebastian Kaempf, who is a lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies here in the school at UQ. Seb is here with me today to talk about his most recent publication, US warfare in Somalia and the trade-off between casualty aversion and civilian protection, that appeared in the June edition of the journal Small Wars and Insurgencies. Seb, thanks very much for joining me. Your paper explores dimensions of the US-led military operation in Somalia in the early 1990s. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the context and the conflict itself before we get into your paper specifically?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me here. I think it's important to start out with the context simply because it is important for any understanding of what subsequently was going on while the Americans found themselves on the ground in Somalia. But of course the question is, how did they get there in the first place, right? So you need to start with the end of the Cold War, and in Somalia you had a military dictator, Siad Barre, who had been in power for a very long time. His power with the end of the Cold War, with the drying up of superpower support, his power started to be contested by various factions, but most prominently by a coalition led by two particular figures, Mohammed Farah Aidid and Ali Mahdi, who essentially managed to oust Siad Barre from the capital Mogadishu. Barre withdrew south close to the border of between Somalia and Kenya and tried to sort of relaunch various attacks. So the two who had ousted him, Ali Mahdi and Mohammed Farah Aidid, found themselves fighting a resurgent Siad Barre and his forces further down in the south. At the same time, however, they also fell out between themselves. So the two who had managed to oust the former dictator turned the weapons against one another. And so you find the beginning of the Somali civil war essentially around two big political / military heads, Mohammed Farah Aidid versus Ali Mahdi. That leads to essentially a division of the capital of Mogadishu and a civil war that is going on. But because Barre is still involved in this, this conflict had already spread beyond the capital and involved various clans and sub-clans on either of the side of the warring factions, which meant that the conflict had essentially spread throughout of Somalia. So you have the political contestation continuing through violence, military violence, but at the same time, this comes on top of what has been a very long drought. So, where the harvest was just really bad and the situation had become really dire. Add to this, the military conflict means that this drought got exacerbated and turned into what a lot of commentators have described back then as a famine of a biblical scale. Of course, as we all know, a famine doesn't mean that there's no food. Essentially what had happened is that all the warring factions tried to use food as a source of or as a weapon. So you give food to those who support you and you deny food to those who fight on the other side, or who support the other side. And that essentially meant that this very complex military, humanitarian, economic situation led to the death of some 400,000 Somali civilians. And that happened around the time when Americans sat down to have Thanksgiving turkey, and watching the news of starving Somali children on television. So the political pressures, of course, not only in the US but elsewhere in the Western world, were rising to do something about that situation, which essentially led to a situation where the United Nations had sent in peacekeepers to provide humanitarian aid to those who were starving. But of course, what wasn't really understood by the decision makers that sent the UN peacekeepers into Somalia was how much food had become a weapon in that conflict. So imagine, you now send peacekeepers under a Chapter 6 mandate, that means they are not allowed to forcefully distribute that food, send them into Somalia, where and just essentially dump tens of thousands of tons of food into this complex conflict scenario meant that all this food was snatched. A great or horrific example is a food convoy by the International Committee of the Red Cross that left Mogadishu with 16 trucks to go to Baidoa. By the time it arrived, only one truck was left. Everything else was snatched. So essentially the war continued, and in fact was to some extent fueled by the delivery of humanitarian aid. And it dawned on the last person that clearly this doesn't work. What in fact was needed was armed peacekeepers who would be on the ground and force that food to arrive to those who were starving to death. And so that brings in the United States for the first time. This is like the last big humanitarian act by President Herbert Walker Bush, Bush the Elder, who agrees to send up to 28,000 American forces into Somalia in December 1992, whose mandate was to basically use force to stop the famine. And so they go in and try to provide for that type of food. Now in the article, that particular mission, which is called Restore Hope, or what we know today as UNITAF, didn't get much mentioning for the simple fact that it would have blown the word size out of proportions.
A problem familiar to many of us in the field. Your paper asks specifically whether the US, when they did become involved, when there was a recognition of the need for some type of enforcement capacity to ensure that that aid actually reached the Somalis. Your paper then asks whether the US ultimately lent towards prioritising the minimisation of casualties to their own troops or a concern with civilian protection. Can you outline your findings in that sense?
Yeah. So the US became involved in two missions. The first one I just outlined, UNITAF or Restore Hope.
Okay.
Yeah, between December 92 to April/May 1993. And then in the second one called UNOSOM 2, United Nations mission to Somalia, which the Americans stayed on with a smaller contingent. And what we mostly know when you hear about Somalia and Black Hawk Down and the fallout between the US/the UN and Somali warlords like Adid on the ground, that's what happens under UNOSOM 2.
Okay.
But that doesn't, and so the focus of the paper itself is on that second mission, because that's really when we talk about the situation spiraling out of control and a full-out war happening on the ground. Doesn't mean though that under UNITAF, that first mission between December 92 and May 1993, the Americans didn't use force. Yeah? But what was really striking is that they set up a certain kind of standard in which they engaged whenever they had to use force. And they had been given one of the biggest and freest mandates by the UN Security Council. In fact, the mandate that had been given said very clearly that they should, clear all the weapons off the streets, they should engage the warlords, and they should deliver food. But the Americans who led that mission was being quite concerned of the ghosts of Vietnam and of Lebanon, decided to purely focus on the humanitarian aid. So the casualty aversion that we have seen in US warfare since Vietnam, or as a result of Vietnam, really drove the approach the American leaders, the leaders of UNITAF, took on the ground. When I interviewed people like Robert Oakley, who led the UNITAF mission, or Tony Zinni, who was in charge of the military operations as a deputy there, they made it, or General Johnston, who was the force commander there, they made it very clear that they, before going into Somalia, revisited the American experiences in Vietnam and in Lebanon, and they were really adamant not to make the same mistakes. And the mistake for them was that you had become involved and gotten bogged down in a civil war that you couldn't extract yourself that easily. So for them, the overriding principle, because they were concerned with their own casualties, and this was a humanitarian operation, right? This was doing good things. How can you sell this to the American public that you risk the lives of your own soldiers? All this drove that someone like Oakley actually went and engaged with Aidid and Mahdi prior to the US intervention, and made it very clear to them, said, look, we don't want to become involved politically. All we want to do is deliver some humanitarian aid. So if you don't mess with us, we're not going to mess with you. And so they struck a deal with Aidid and Ali Mahdi. which suited Aidid and it suited Ali Mahdi, right? They could pursue their political interests, but not get in the way. The Americans wouldn't get in the way. Doesn't mean that the Americans didn't use force, but what they did, they always used force in a way that they tried to minimize any impact this could have on Somali civilians. Because they knew that you cannot afford in that mission to have the local population turn against you.
Yeah.
So for example, whenever they engaged with the attack helicopters, and they did this quite a bit, they would always send out early warning system through loudspeakers put up on the helicopter. Which of course means that you warn your enemies before you even get there. So you might risk compromising your own concerns for casualties. At the same time though, it gave a lot of sufficient warning to civilians to clear out. And you know, that environment, particular urban environment in Mogadishu, always meant that you had soldiers and civilians in the same places. But wherever they engaged here, there was in a sense a situation where the Americans managed to keep up very high levels of casualty-aversion or concerns for their own troops, whilst at the same time ensuring very large amounts of civilian protection. That's at the first UNITAF stage. Yeah? Things change, but I mean that was really peaceful, you know, that first mission. Things change when the conflict gets hotter. And that's at that point where a situation arises, which this paper traces, where the Americans, due to the strategies Aidid took, were forced to make a decision. Is it going to be that we prioritize civilian protection, or are we going to prioritize concerns for our own troops? And it's very clear that they took the decision at a certain point in the conflict. In fact, it was on the 12th of July 1993, up the house raid, to actually go prioritize the concern for their own troops over the protection of Somali civilians.
And you make the point in the paper, don't you, that elements of Aidid's tactics, in particular urban sort of guerrilla warfare tactics, really forced the United States into more of, or encouraged them into more of that choice between the provision of, or the concern with the welfare of the Somali civilians on the one hand versus civilian concerns with the preservation of their own troops on the other. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, these two norms that I see as the two most characteristic norms in US warfare, casualty aversion and civilian protection, the concern for the lives of your own troops versus the concern for innocent non-combatant Somali lives in this case. Now that relationship, these two norms are inherently in tension with one another. The problem arises if you have some adversary like Aidid in an asymmetric context who tries to exploit these two norms, because essentially these are, for US adversaries, two key weaknesses in American warfare. And by doing this, and I'll talk about Aidid's strategies in a second, but by doing this, what was a tension-laden relationship essentially became exacerbated, and there became turned into a real trade-off that then forced American decision makers to choose one over the other, because you couldn't have both intact at the same level anymore. What Aidid did, I mean, Aidid realized very quickly that there's all sorts of asymmetries in place. The overarching one, of course, that the asymmetry of interest. For the Americans, essentially, this was like backwater Somalia, a humanitarian mission where we now were, at the time of UNISOM II, involved in nation building and post-conflict reconstruction. Fair enough, but it was not a vital security interest, certainly not at the level of political and personal life interest that Aidid had. So he would always be free to go at much greater length to employ all sorts of strategies that the Americans wouldn't have even considered. But for him it was very clear that, you know, he strategically, or speaking in military capabilities, he was, of course, vastly inferior to the Americans. You know, like rocket-propelled grenade and machine guns versus attack helicopters and armored vehicles and all that sort of stuff. Yeah? So what he tried to focus on is really interesting. In fact, what he did focus on is exactly what he told someone like Robert Oakley back in December 1992, when Oakley had made that deal with him, saying, look, we're not going to mess with you if you don't mess with us. And Aidid had responded and said, Mr. Ambassador, I totally agree. And if you stick to your agreement, I'm going to be following this through. However, if you depart from this, let me tell you that I have studied Vietnam and I've studied Lebanon, and I know how to get rid of you guys. And he told Oakley back then, it's like, I'm gonna make you guys increase the number of civilian casualties on the ground, and it's gonna turn the population against you. First point. Second point, I know that if I kill just a handful of you guys, given the asymmetry in interests, you guys gonna get huge political problems. And that's what he did. You see increasingly now the Americans getting attacked, and they get attacked by snipers and gunmen from Hadid hiding behind civilians, hiding in mosques, hiding, using the civilian population as a shield, making it very complicated for the Americans who now get attacked to fire back without necessarily killing civilians. And of course the biggest prize here was to start killing Americans themselves. And that meant that he created a security environment on the ground that for the Americans made it impossible to essentially... The Americans lost rule of the street. At one point into this conflict, and this is way before the Black Hawk Down incident, for the Americans it was only possible to be on the ground for something like 15 to 20 minutes before essentially the entire city would descend upon them. And that's why the Americans decided to move back to they lost the footprint and instead relied on helicopters. And for Hadid, that was the center of gravity. This was what it would take to pin down the Americans, shoot down some of these helicopters, and you change the whole ball game. Because now they're on the ground where you dictate the game.
And this, of course, where the famous Black Hawk Down incident becomes reality. One of the other points you make in the paper is that even in situations where there is a choice to prioritise civilian welfare, the international humanitarian law around that is notoriously weak. And in fact, you, by contrast, endorse Michael Waltz's notion of an ethic of due care. Can you take us through that in terms of some of the limits of international humanitarian law, as you said?
Yeah, it's good, thanks, because it allows me to clarify something. What I said earlier is that the Americans started prioritizing concern for their own troops over the lives of Somali civilians. Which, of course, anyone who would hear this or someone who would watch this would think like, well, this is a big outcry. But we have to bear in mind that there's nothing in international humanitarian law or the Geneva Convention or the laws of war, however you call them. There's nothing in international humanitarian law that forbids you to make that type of decision. And what the paper does is to actually look into American operations after they started prioritizing casualty aversion over civilian protection, and says, well, what does international humanitarian law have to say about this? And what's really interesting is that this is nothing that international humanitarian law forbids, which proves two things. The first one is that it is an incredible grey zone, international humanitarian, that allows you to do quite evil things, i.e. killing of civilians that is quite predictable. But it also explains to us why that is, because international humanitarian law tends to side with the arguments of military necessity. It has been necessary to do these things. So you can justify a lot of these actions that we see in war when you kill civilians, that this is not illegal, it's not condemned by it. And this is the criticism I make in this paper, to say, well, obviously, there's nothing in international humanitarian law, despite all sorts of very strong indications of horrific things that have been done, that condemns this. But we've got not legal but moral categories to use to analyze the same political or military scenario. And here it is particularly Michael Waltz's idea of due care, which I find very useful, because he turns that relationship that we see in international humanitarian law upside down. If the laws of war say that you can prioritize the concerns for the lives of your soldiers over the lives of civilians, then Michael Waltz says, hang on a second, civilians, you shouldn't do this from a moral point of view, because civilians are unarmed, and therefore entitled that due care is being taken with their lives. And so he argues, not from a legal but from a moral point of view, that if an increase to the risks your own soldiers take leads to marginal improvement of the safety of innocent civilians, then this is a step that you as a commander have to take.
Obliged to take. That's interesting. So, in a sense, you could see some of these arguments applying to, and in fact you have seen some of these arguments applying to debates over the use of drones, for example, in Afghanistan, that arguably are indiscriminate in terms of the way they inflict violence. Is that discrimination dimension central in your view to the idea that, you know, we have to be careful about erring on the side of military force when it comes to international humanitarian law?
I mean, that's a big question, and of course a very topical one, given the incredible use of drone warfare by, starting with the Bush administration, but of course the vast expansion we see under the Obama administration at the moment. Seems to be the weapon of choice. And it raises all sorts of issues and questions, but I want to point to two in particular, and feel free to grill me on more of them. But I think the first one is, and that's really interesting, is that in both Afghanistan and Iraq, but also in Yemen and Somalia and other places where drones have been used, or Pakistan, the use of drones with that kind of sophisticated technology, and I mean like the ability to have surveillance and have a relative precise weapon here that can be conducted into these territories unheard of, unseen, but without any risks to any soldiers, has meant in general that the Americans have been willing to pursue more ambitious targets than they used to pursue in other forms of, say, aerial bombardment. And that is the main reason as to why we've got so many civilian casualties alongside. Irrespective of the fact that, of course, on the other receiving end of drone warfare, you have people who can legitimately be killed if they're enemy fighters. But they, of course, know that the best way to protect themselves is to actually only walk surrounded by civilians as a deterrent. That's the first point. The second point is a wider point, and that is that the reason as to why, that's sort of a very fundamental point about the just war tradition and international humanitarian law, as to why soldiers are permitted to kill other soldiers without that killing to be considered murder. It's a bit bizarre, right? That they can kill, whereas in domestic affairs would be considered murder. In war it's somewhat different, and the reason why they're allowed to do this is that their soldiers facing each other on the battlefield stand in a condition of reciprocal risk. That means that if you had a sword and I had a sword, I would be entitled to kill you, because technically I'm killing you in self-defense. Because if I didn't kill you, you would kill me. So that condition of reciprocity is fundamental as to why the just war tradition first and then the laws of war have given authority to kill in war. The problem you get with drone warfare, in particular, given its sort of dimensions that it takes in US warfare, but US warfare in general, is that the conditions of asymmetry have become so vast that the Americans are able to actually kill with barely facing any risk of reciprocal death. That's really striking, because I think this is the first time now in history that we're seeing a power engage in a type of war where that condition of reciprocity is about to disappear. You know, they can topple Milosevic and have no combat-related casualties. They can basically wage a drone warfare with indigenous forces in Libya or in Kosovo and in other places without any battle deaths. Yet, and that's because you sit in Arizona as a drone pilot. So what then, if the condition of reciprocity is the main reason as to why you're allowed to kill in war, how then can a pilot who sits back in Arizona still draw on the laws of war to justify legitimating killing in war?
That's fascinating. It certainly changes the playing field significantly. And I should reassure people watching this at home, we don't have any swords or indeed drones.
It would be fun though.
It would. Well, the swords would be fun.
You know, you can buy like remote control drones now with a camera over your iPhone. You could fly it around the corridor of our offices here, into our heads of school's office. Is she drinking a coffee right now? I don't know.
There'd be a few colleagues I wouldn't be happy about. No, I'd scratch that from the record. So one of the points that you make in the paper is that the Abdi house raid was really a bit of a turning point in terms of the US, in terms of the intervention in Somalia. Can you take us through that? Because that seems a bit different from the way it's often presented, I think.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think, one of the nice contributions of this paper is that it adds an additional layer to the big question of how these events, the Black Hawk Down events on the 3rd of October 1993 could have actually happened. In most accounts that you get a story of, like the UNITAF Restore Hope mission that we talked about earlier, the purely humanitarian one, then got changed into nation building, post-conflict reconstruction, engaging with the warlords, that sort of agenda. Mm-hmm. And a lot of critics, and there's lots of critics on the US involvement in Somalia in the early 1990s, what most of these critics always say is that, you know, with the change of that, with the introduction of that ambitious agenda, of course you would have clashed with Aidid. Of course there would have been this fallout that we then of course have seen on the 3rd of October. And they point to events like in early June, on the 5th of June 1993, upon inspecting one of Aidid's weapons sites, but at the same time radio stations, the UN Pakistani peacekeepers came under attack and were killed. In fact, it was the biggest killing of any UN peacekeepers since the Congo in the 60s. And of course, everyone went gung-ho, and then the Americans pushed through the very next day a new resolution through the UN Security Council in which they called for the capturing of Aidid. They identified his faction and him as the culprit in this. That got confirmed by an inquiry, but only like 3-4 months later. But the nevertheless pushed it through. So in a sense, that resolution following the attack on the Pakistani peacekeepers essentially turned the United Nations, in which the US was a pivotal part of under UNOSOM II, into another clan in the warfare in Somalia. They had become another warring faction, hunting down Aidid. And that was seen as, well, there's a linear line between that and the Black Hawk Down incident. And what you don't get is any talk about the Abdi House. In fact, the UN Blue Book, which is sort of the UN's diary of their missions, it's that thick. It has all the details on all these different Somalia missions. The Abdi House raid gets mentioned in like 3 lines, that big. There's no record on it. People usually don't really say much about it. But engaging with what was happening there, and the tip-off came from a couple of journalists I interviewed, really brought out something interesting, and that is that the big turning point was not really the 5th of June attack on the Pakistanis, at least from the perspective of Aidid. The big turning point for Aidid came on the 12th of July, for Aidid and the Somalis, on the 12th of July 1993, when the Americans, as their leaders under UNOSOM II claimed, were targeting a war council, where some of Aidid's men were in. And what's really important to understand is this attack was the beginning of the Americans dropping the policy that they would give early warnings through loudspeakers, as they had done throughout, and which had ensured high numbers of civilian protection. With that, in preparation for this particular engagement, there were debates, and it was decided, for military reasons and because of concerns for their own casualties, that this policy would be dropped. No more advance warnings and no ground forces. Instead, attack helicopters firing missiles into this building. The problem is that there's conflicting statements. And there's a lot of evidence that exists from within UNOSOM and from without that indicates that this was not a war council, but a peace meeting of clan elders who didn't like Aidid's militarist stance against the UN, and who were meeting at that particular time in this building to negotiate and find ways to negotiate with the UN. 84 people got killed. Now the leaders of UNOSOM II argue that this was a military target. Various journalists, and including the head of the UNOSOM Justice Division, Anne Wright, argue that this was not a war council, and there's sufficient evidence to indicate that it was purely covered by civilians. The reason why this is important, and it sort of looks into the mechanisms of, why was this attack covered by international humanitarian law? Was it legal? Was it illegal? And it finds, despite the horrific acts, actually there was nothing illegal about it. Because in the minds of those who took a decision, they thought it was a military target. So what looks like disproportionate means of use of force at first sight were not disproportionate, because the question of proportionality didn't arise in the first place, at least in the minds of the decision makers. And that is the whole problem, is that it's about the intention that someone has when they engage in a military target. Now, according to the decision makers in the interviews that I conducted with them, explained to me that they thought, in true honesty, that this was, and that they had intelligence, that this was a military target. Lots of other evidence exists, in fact more evidence that this was a civilian target. Be this as it may, what's really important for the events of Somalia overall and the US engagement in it is that this particular event had various effects. First of all, it killed off the clan elders that had taken an oppositional stance to Aidid. So he was in a sense the last one standing. Secondly, the Americans now killed a lot of civilians. It pissed lots of people off. And the effect was that people, even those who didn't support Aidid, as a consequence of the Abdi house raid, rallied behind him. It strengthened his leadership. And it increased the opposition to what was seen as invading forces. And within that, very importantly, was a change in the perception. Up until the Abdi house raid, Aidid saw the enemy primarily with the UN. He couldn't stand Boutros Ghali, that was the main reason. But it changed with the Abdi house raid from the UN to the US. Now the US became the main target. And that's what he did. You see US casualty figures rise consequently as a result after the 12th of July up until the 3rd of October 1993. And it's only a culmination. In other words, in the way in which the story of Somalia and UNOSOM II has been told so far, that pivotal episode has always been missing. And it's crucial in understanding, because we would not have any sense, we couldn't make sense of why things turned out the way they did on the 3rd of October 1993 without the Abdi house.
That's fascinating. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, but just finally, your assessment of the implications of this case for humanitarian intervention specifically, or expeditionary war more generally?
Well, I think Somalia is a fascinating case if you're interested in US warfare and asymmetric conflict. I guess maybe it's just interesting for me, but I find it fascinating because it is the first asymmetric conflict, or what people call small wars or low-intensity conflicts, whatever you might call them, but the first of these types of really asymmetric conflicts that the Americans get involved in since Vietnam. The American response post-Vietnam was, we're no longer doing Vietnam at all. None of that sort of domestic conflict that we want to get involved in, we shy away from it. In Somalia they get in. But they get in at a time when these two particular norms that I'm interested in, casualty-aversion and civilian protection, have crystallized very clearly. So Somalia in the early 1990s, therefore, is the first case study you can do on asymmetric conflicts, on how these two norms, casualty-aversion, civilian protection, actually play out. Now, the findings of this article have three implications: one legal, one moral, one strategic. The legal one is that it gives you an in-depth case study of the operations that the Americans have been conducting, and investigates it through the lens of international humanitarian law. And it goes through some of the really horrific episodes like the Abdi house raid. And it shows you that this was in line with international humanitarian law. It didn't violate the laws of war. When I first started this research, I was convinced I had a war crime at my hands. And I was so fascinated by it that I actually tried to prove that. You know how hard it is to prove a violation of the laws of war? Because it's again about intentionality. And the intention, according to the statements of the decision makers, was never to kill civilians. This was a war council. So you as a researcher, you have to now prove that they're essentially lying to you. Or only have their word, or have to prove other evidence. But unless you have this, there's nothing wrong with that type of attack, because at the time of the attack, they assumed it was a legitimate target. So I use this to illustrate these problems that I think international humanitarian law has. It provides for this horrific, stretchable gray zone that essentially permits vicious or cruel acts, i.e. the killing of innocent civilians, to happen, even if it's kind of predictable. That's the first side, so like this gray area. Secondly, the moral argument to say that, well, only because there is, everything is in line with the laws of war doesn't mean that it exhausts all moral judgment. I mean, law and morality are very different planes. And even if this particular episode or these operations that we've seen on the 12th of July and subsequently, including the 3rd of October 1993, if they have been in line with the laws of war, it does not necessarily mean that there aren't any moral issues. And I think there are huge moral issues. And that's why I draw on Walzer's idea of due care, to illustrate that there would have been other avenues that could have been taken by decision makers. The decision makers decided at this particular point, and all subsequent operations, by the way, went along this line, to prioritize casualty aversion over civilian protection, covered by the laws of war. Michael Walzer says, well, we need to reverse that relationship, provided that if I accept higher levels of risk to my own soldiers, and this then subsequently leads to a reduction of risks to civilians, then I'm obliged to take those steps. Not with unlimited increase of risks to soldiers, of course, but within a particular range. And there would have been a lot of other ways around, as for example the previously classified memo by Anne Wright says, why don't you go in and capture those people, put them before court, give them a chance to explain themselves, rather than firing missiles into a building. So it uses a lot of the interview material, the material that's around, to illustrate that there are severe moral issues, and had due care been practiced, that incident probably would not have happened. And that brings me to the final one, and then we can go all home and have our cocktails, is that this is not just, some peacenik talking about morality and group hugs and that sort of stuff. But I think what's really interesting here is that you can make a clear connection between the moral aspect and the strategic implications of this case study. And that is that had they not changed the policy, had they, in other words, practiced due care, we would not have had that particular fallout from the Abdi house raid. And I would argue without the Abdi house raid, we would not have had the 3rd of October 1993. In other words, we would not have had these disastrous effects that essentially led to President Clinton withdrawing from Somalia, the international community withdrawing from Somalia, and Somalia essentially being left to itself for most of the next following 10 to 12 years.
Fascinating. I don't think you're the Lone Ranger in being interested in this particular case or the implications it has, Seb. And fascinating research showing that Seb's not just the second best tennis player in the School of Political Science and International Studies here at UQ.
Am I supposed to now say who was the best tennis player?
I think they know. I think the people at home know. Okay. Thanks very much, Seb, for joining us for this Research in Focus discussion, and we hope we'll see you again some stage soon. Cheers.